Okay, we'll go back to item 9, English Learner Task Force Report. Deputy Superintendent Patty Norman. And if you'd like to introduce yourself and all those who will be speaking with you, that would be great.
Deputy Superintendent Patty Norman, Student Achievement, and I'd like to introduce Dr. Christelle Estrada, who is over these programs. And as we're moving forward, the first thing that we would like to do is thank the board for recognizing this as a need through the Eliminating Barriers Task Force. And through that recognition, it speaks well to our strategic plan and our goals being visited through the lens of equity. So as we go through these findings, there are 4 findings, but there were more recommendations from the committee. But really what we needed to do was establish a way for the board to connect to these findings and recommendations. And so the findings that are going to be presented are a culmination of those recommendations together in an actionable way of what the board can actually do as their role in implementing these findings and recommendations. Thank you. Okay, let me get to the beginning. Okay, Dr. Estrada.
So we had a great group and really wonderful representation. Rich and I was the superintendent. We had someone at Moss Elementary who's done really amazing work as a principal of a school that has been very skillful and doing mindfulness related to social emotional learning with refugee students, with lots of Arabic-speaking paraprofessionals who are certified. Ivy Ferguson is the Utah International Charter School assistant principal, has done great work. Deidre Strait, parent of Highland High School. Michelle Eldridge, really doing excellent work in relationship to allocating funding based on language proficiency. So a really strategic way of thinking about the kind of support necessary for someone who's a newcomer. Craig Carter from Davis School District, and then Kenna Rogers finishing her doctorate at the University of Utah as an instructional coach at the secondary level at Horizonte. And then Kim Fratta was a co-facilitator. Actually, as Patty mentioned, as superintendent, whatever your name is.
You can just call me whatever. Patty's good.
This was a really interesting way in which the board's Eliminating Barriers Task Force identified a really strong interest in teachers across the state as well as at equity departments to look at the achievement of English learners, students learning English, whether they're immigrants, refugees, or long-term English learners, and then identifying based on the report that I did almost a year ago, their concern for creating a committee to really look at this, and then the role of developing policy levers so that the board can act on that. So this will give you a sense of the timeline. It was July 2018 when I did the initial presentation for the task force. And highlighted some of the really wonderful, promising practices that we see in schools. You know, I always say to people, we don't really have to go to California or Texas or other places. There's extraordinary teaching going on. So that's what we want to highlight, to identify, to share, to disseminate, and to upscale across the state. So it was assigned and approved by members on October 2018. We actually worked throughout the summer to really have deep conversations based on the categories related to the Eliminating Task Force committee that initially identified. And then you'll see that in the drafts. We did drafts, revisions. We had an advisory board that was made up of principals, K-12, and we gave them their first draft, as well as all the alternative language services directors throughout the state. And there was a great response in relationship to the things that were identified by the board and how they would be aligned to the strategic plan.
So at this time, we're asking if we can go through the 4 findings, the 4 policy levers, and then after that, be able to ask for questions, because some of those other questions might come up along the way as you hear the other levers that are being articulated. Would that be appropriate?
Yes, please.
Okay, thanks. So the first one deals with course grade forgiveness. So course grade forgiveness is not being implemented consistently across the LEAs, and awareness of the opportunity is limited. The policy could be used as a tool to promote equitable access to the opportunity to replace a grade and increase access to a grade level content among students who are learning English and other student groups. Finding 2. Almost 1/3 of students who are designated as English learners are not proficient within 6 years of designation. The pull-out approach to instruction limits students' access to grade-level content in Tier 1 instruction. Teachers would benefit from professional learning focused on providing language instruction to grade or course-level academic content. Finding 3. Almost 300 schools have been identified for targeted support and improvement, TSI, status because of the students learning English student group is performing at or below the lowest performing 5% of schools. I'm going to say that one more time. Performing at or below the lowest performing 5% of schools. Many schools and districts are implementing effective, innovative practices to address the needs of students learning English. There is an opportunity for the state to highlight those practices to facilitate recognition, replication, and adoption. Finding 4, currently the state's foundation funding formula does not adjust for funding for students who are learning English. Some schools that are not eligible for Title III funds do not recognize their responsibility to identify students who are learning English and provide targeted language support. USBE has contracted with a researcher to conduct a comprehensive study of Utah's education funding system. The objective is to determine the extent to which current funding formulas meet their intended purposes and provide equitable access to education. This study will include an equity analysis analyzing cost differences for supporting students with additional needs, including students who are learning English. The findings from the equity analysis will inform conversations about weighting state funding provided to LEAs according to the student need. The study will not address the way LEAs distribute funds to the school level. Some LEAs, including Provo School District and Ogden School District, are leading out in this area. At this time, we open it up to questions.
So board members, if you have any questions on those findings. Wow, it was explained very well. Thank you. Okay. Oh, you have a question?
No.
Okay. Okay. Are we ready for those? Does that include? Okay. Thank you. Board Member Lear.
We have 4 motions, and I'll make the first 2, if that's okay. The first motion is that I move that the USBE staff gather information from LEAs to identify barriers to the implementation of R277-717, which is the course grade forgiveness rule, and review other policies related to course access to ensure equitable access for each student group to early college course-taking opportunities. That's a mouthful.
Okay, so is there, so this is a recommended, it doesn't need a second, this is a recommended motion from the Eliminating Barriers, or excuse me, the English Learner Task Force. Is there any discussion to that motion? Chair Huntsman.
Yes, I think it'd be important that as these motions are being read, that they're linked, even though we see them on here linked to finding 1, finding 2,
Yeah.
somehow.
Thank you. So motion 1 is linked to finding 1. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you
That's
for that clarification.
very helpful
Okay.
information.
Okay,
Thank you.
and when we get to finding 2
Yep.
okay, thank you.
Okay, Board Member Belknap?
I have a question. I know this has come out of the task force and that Member Lear also said this, but to ensure equitable access, that ensure gives me a little bit of heartburn because I'm not sure how you ensure it if we're investigating it. I don't know. I'm okay with it, but yeah.
Well,
I'm not sure you can ever ensure.
can I speak to that?
Yes, you may.
I think your point is well taken. We could move it to something more like encourage or work toward or something like that. But I think the ultimate goal is ultimate access, otherwise we have some legal and constitutional problems. But I understand that's aspirational, sort of.
Board Member Davis?
You could change it to increase because that is more than encourage. I mean, that's actually
Right.
doing something.
And it's quantifiable.
It's not going to be 100% like ensure is, but it's increasing
Is
and
that a
moving
motion?
and acting.
Would you like to make that
Yes.
motion to amend?
I make that motion to amend to change the word ensure to increase.
Is there a second to that motion? Okay, that's been seconded. The motion to amend is to change the word ensure to increase. Okay, any discussion to that amendment? Okay, seeing no discussion, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, that motion passes unanimously. Okay, so we're back to the original motion. Is there any discussion to that motion? Okay, so I'll restate the motion. The motion is to gather information from LEAs to identify barriers to implementation of R277713-3 and review other policies related to course access to increase equitable access for each student group to early college course-taking opportunities.
Just a correction of
717.
717 as opposed to 713.
Thank you very much. 717-3, thank you. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, that motion passes unanimously. Okay,
Okay,
your
the next
second
motion
motion?
is related to finding two, and this is the concern that one-third of the students who are designated as ELL students are not proficient within 6 years of designation. So we're not doing our job. It's kind of not pointing any fingers, but the board, to begin with, has some work to do. So the second motion is related to that. And with that, I move that the USB staff provide options to the board for increasing equitable access to language instruction to academic content in a student's grade or course level, including recognitions, incentives, requirements, and evidence of compliance, extended time, professional learning to ensure comprehensive counseling provides equitable access toward growth of language proficiency and endorsements.
Okay, that is the motion before us from committee. Okay. Is there any discussion to that motion? Okay, Board Member Belknap.
Sorry, I was just rereading it for just a minute. My question is on the cost of this, adding this, and maybe that hasn't been weighed out yet. Is this going to fit within someone's already job description, or are we going to need to go for more funding to be able to supply this?
Would anyone like to address that question?
Well, I think the issue is related to addressing the achievement gap, which all you have to do is look at the 2022 goals and the way in which English students learning English, the gaps are huge. There are some districts in the monitoring process that we use, we identify promising practices and dissemination strategies when we give the report to the districts. And the reports that they return to us on the Utah Grants Management System is a way to support them to braid funds in relationship to models and approaches for using funding strategically, because many of the things that we're talking about are actually connected to school improvement teamwork, as well as equity departments, Title III departments, and because Title III accountability is in Title I, and state accountability is connected to the growth and the proficiency levels related to English learners, at least between 9 and 10%. And we have lots of data in relationship to that. So I actually think it's important for us to identify those promising practices, the reports we get back where they get their report, and then they send in, if you're interested in seeing some of those, some of the committee members have seen that. Jordan School District is an example of doing amazing work with braiding funds to look at student outcomes for English learners in a very different way. So I'm kind of a fiscal conservative, and I actually believe that building the capacity of LEAs to use funds strategically related to braiding, and because it's in the Utah Grants Management System, it's an easy way to monitor through their actual response to the findings that you can make a difference. And it's connected with the school improvement work that we do in federal programs anyway. So that's kind of my line, but could be somebody else's.
Okay, Chair Huntsman.
Thank you, Chair. The way that I read the motion is that it's to provide those options, and when those options come back before the board, that's when we will address, do we need additional staff? As we get down into the weeds of what those options look like, we'll probably address those staffing sizes or staffing needs.
Board Member Davis?
I hope I didn't miss this along the way when you were speaking. Just double checking, I think we already talked about this earlier on, but when you mentioned that we're talking about weighting funding depending on needs, is that like a change in the WPU or a line item, or?
No, it's
What
not.
does that
I mean,
look like?
I'll just give you a concrete example. Patients that were directed to the committee, one was John Zerbakken from Davis, and they've worked really hard, and they procedures and tools to ensure that 93% of their students learning English have graduated. They probably have the highest percentage in the entire country. And they didn't futz around with extra funding. So they looked at it strategically and developed those support systems. The other district that's doing really amazing work, the other presenter we had was Superintendent Nye, who's looking at the student learning needs at the center instead of isolating funding related to separate programs. So you combined state, federal programming in relationship to the needs of the students. So a concrete example from Provo is that when they get Title III funding, every single school who has English learners, and they have a team with parents on it, and they do a weighted allocation from federal funding. So someone who's a newcomer, their per pupil allocation, and it's not connected to state funding but to federal funding, is weighted by 3. And the reason that is that generally newcomers who have extra support end up meeting their annual growth goal and moving quickly to English proficiency, so that we don't have long-term English learners endlessly, not having equitable access to grade level content because they're pulled out of Tier 1 instruction. So it has nothing to do with the WPU. It's all these really amazingly innovative approaches to funding and braiding resources. If you look at the Jordan response, they actually used very systematic structures and processes and procedures already developed so that administrators and superintendents, council, as well as teachers and counselors can be better informed and supportive for students learning English. So we have like really amazing and great examples of that, Canyons as well.
Okay, I don't see any other questions on this motion, so I'll restate the motion. The motion is to ask staff to provide options to the board for increasing equitable access to language instruction to academic content in a student's grade or course level, including recognitions, incentives, requirements, and evidence of compliance, extended time, professional learning, to ensure comprehensive counseling provides equitable access toward growth of language proficiency and endorsements. Okay, all in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Okay, that motion passes unanimously. Okay, Board Member Cannon.
I have motion number 3, which is prefaced by the sentence, "The Students Learning English student group is performing at or below the lowest performing 5% of schools." These are our least successful students in our system. So this motion is that we have staff publish an annual report detailing progress towards meeting the board's 2022 Education Elevated targets and closing both the achievement and opportunity gaps between students who are learning English and other student groups. Include in the report status and progress of schools identified for targeted support and improvement status due to the performance of students who are learning English, and highlights of schools and districts that are implementing effective, innovative practices to address the needs of students learning English.
Okay, that is the motion before us from committee. Board Member Scott Hansen, did you have a question or comment?
Please. My question is, so this is an annual report, and our goal is for 2022, so that means there's potentially 2 of these before we need to achieve that goal. I'm wondering if there's not a better way to get information out than waiting for annual. Can we establish a learning community or something that would allow information to pass between the LEAs in a more efficient and maybe more free-flowing format? I think 2 of these reports, I'm not sure how much of a dent that's going to make in what we're trying to accomplish.
Would you like to make a motion to amend?
So I think I'll just add a little bit to this. There are certain processes already developed in relationship to sharing. One is the alternative language services meetings that we have 4 times a year, webinars as well with promising practices. I mean, I'll give you a concrete example. And of course, Title I distinguished schools and the classroom visits that I just came back from. And of course, all of this is in the Utah Grants Management System. So it means it's public, it's documented, and there are opportunities for disseminating promising practices in those contexts. So ultimately, the question ends up being specifically related to the 2022 Education Elevated targets, and what would that look like? And that goes back to the idea of, and I'll give one example is that in Provo, Spring Creek Elementary has 80% poverty, 40% English learners. Their growth scores in the content areas for English learners is between 10 and 20% higher than native English speakers in Provo. So the question ultimately ends up being about the effectiveness of dissemination of promising practices. So you can change the rule. The question ultimately ends up really about how you disseminate those kinds of practices, you incentivize it, and you reward that. Another example is in the Utah International Charter School. It's some of the best science and physics instruction I've ever seen anywhere. And so because of ESSA, they end up actually getting extra funding in relationship to the needs of students related to promising practices that we've actually seen. So those are some really concrete examples of the way you disseminate promising practices.
Okay, Board Member Hansen?
Follow with a question before I make a motion then. So in lieu of an annual report, are there any suggestions about a more efficient way maybe to distribute and disseminate best practices throughout the state?
Well, I think, there ends up being lots of ways to do that. The reason I use the Utah Grants Management System is that it ends up creating kind of an electronic portfolio for the way in which resources are being allocated strategically in relationship to outcomes for students. And when you use the actual report card and work with charter schools, I'm working with some charter schools now, in relationship and in the school improvement team. So the question ultimately means, how do you want to disseminate it? And what are the ways that are the most strategic And I'll give you another concrete example. When we send the report to the districts with recommendations and commendations for teachers, the expectation is that schools actually commend the teachers for promising practices, and that the principals, this was a good example in Jordan, the principals, when they actually saw the report, then went to other schools where there were promising practices for teachers. So the function of something being really systematic is embedded in the way in which the process for monitoring has been changed. The way in which the teams go out to monitor include content specialists from assessment, from special education, from teaching and learning, from federal programs. So across the entire agency, you have a large team that goes out and works with individual classrooms. We actually see what's going on. We meet with parents of English learners. I had a great one up in Weber. Instructional coaches, meet with instructional coaches to find out what the challenges are. Dr. Donaldson and I had an amazing meeting with the Alpine district and all the principals. So it's a way in which the superintendency, actually at every district, ends up seeing the promising practices in their own district. So that's one way to think about it.
Okay. Yes, Deputy Superintendent Norman?
And if I can add on to the very clear expertise of Dr. Estrada, in talking amongst the committee, it was about promoting that experience and that knowledge in a way that who is looking at the report. So some of these promising practices are kept very individualized, meaning that those that might be making very important decisions aren't reading these very important reports. So by elevating it to an annual report that's at this level, then those that are really making those decisions can be better informed about the decisions that are being made. So maybe as part of the motion, it's not and/or, but it might be in addition to current work that is being done in articulating and collaborating together on these and annual report.
So just one more follow-up.
Yep.
So if I'm understanding correctly, the material, the information is available. This is more on the receiving end, seeing that it's promoting it being pulled into the LEAs or the schools that need to do it. So that's what we're trying to promote here with the annual report. And then again, my question, is there a better way to do that than, I really just see 2 reports coming out before we hit this 2022 goal. Is there something else we should consider, or is that the best method to highlight it?
Well, I guess the question is about impact. What are the things that directly impact the practices of the LEA and the superintendency in those LEAs to make changes? I actually think the TSI process for identification, the school improvement process, these are all things that are aligned, that are immediately relevant. And if you want reports that help you better look at what districts are doing, those would be available for you at any time you would want them. The board would want them. In fact, the committee, they actually saw Jordan's, and I think it was Canyon's as well, so.
Okay. We're going to allow Superintendent Dixon to respond to this, and then Board Member Hanson, Linda Hanson.
I really appreciate Board Member Hanson's question, and I want to just highlight, I think it should always be a question of how does this get into the classroom? And that's been a challenge that we have with a lot of things where we set policy and we might even monitor it, but how does it get to the classroom? This is such a great example of an initiative from this office where you have a team of experts going into classrooms with a highly tuned protocol that they collaborate on to co-develop that protocol, and then they tune it together so that when they go in, they're looking for the same things. And then they give feedback to the school, the overall school, so that the principal knows then how to turn around and support the teachers. I have actually had principals from schools that they've visited stop me, I won't say on the street because I'm not out walking the streets, but in grocery stores and in other places where they recognize me, and they will come to me and say, hey, I just had your team in, and I have to tell you that Title III visit, giving me feedback about classroom practices and school-wide practices to help our English language learners become proficient both in language and in content is the best thing that I've been given. This is the one thing that I get consistent positive feedback about, because it's not just monitoring and creating a report, but it's actually providing the kind of technical assistance that our office can provide in a way that's immediately usable for the teacher in the classroom. So there are probably a lot of ways to disseminate the information, but it's that technical support that staff is providing at the school and then the district level. So it's getting to all these layers within the system like no other way that we've done before. And that's the profound piece of feedback that we're getting. It's very systemic, to Dr. Estrada's point. So we'll keep working on efficiencies, but I think the systemic model is one of the best things that our office has done in a long time.
Board Member Linda Hansen.
A question for Dr. Dixon. So what Scott Hansen was describing sounded to me like what Jeff wanted ULEAD to do. So to look at what was working and then distribute that information out to schools and so the teachers would have it. Is that not working out that way then?
I had not made that direct connection, although that's exactly what Dr. Withers is trying to do with ULEAD and is disseminating some of those practices. I think the difference is context matters. And so you can read a best practice, but not always know how to implement it in your classroom. So it's that looking at the best practice, putting it in your context and getting feedback that's that systemic piece of support. But to your point, the place to start is, hey, I see that school Z is doing this well. Then it would be behooving to them to go into that school and see what those practices are. And that's like, we don't want to be in their space all the time. So it's that gradual release of getting those best practices out there in the report and highlighting where it's happening well. So then they will start collaborating and contacting each other. So that in that way, it's exactly what ULEAD was meant to do. But this is at a granular level to then lay that on top of the ULEAD. So thank you for that question. We'll have to be more intentional about that.
And I would add that we do have a board member that's represented on the steering committee of ULEAD. And so even if that was something that Board Member Hansen wanted to add to the motion, that this could be a topic that could go to ULEAD through the steering committee to be an area of dissemination as well as a look at those practices. So. Board Member Scott Hansen.
So I'll return. I think my biggest issue with this is just the static nature of an annual report. It takes a long time to compile. By the time you get it published and looking good, it's out to everyone, and a lot of it's outdated, or there are new things that have come along that aren't captured in the annual report. So I think my motion will be to develop a method of disseminating information on progress toward, and then the rest of that would all read the same as it is there, but develop a real-time method to disseminate information detailing, and then would go along from that.
For clarification, were you substituting or just adding that at the beginning?
So instead of that, an annual report be published, it would say, develop a method for real-time dissemination of information detailing progress toward. So, is that clear enough, Lorraine?
I can't make it on that.
So develop a method for disseminating real-time information.
Information detailing.
Detailing,
So we pick
okay.
up at detailing and then just follow through.
Okay, so the amendment is to strike publish an annual report and substitute that with develop a method of disseminating information,
Real-time
detailing,
information.
real-time information. Okay, is there a second to that amendment? Okay, is there a second? Sorry. Second. Okay. Any discussion then to that? We'll begin with Superintendent Dixon.
I have a clarifying question then. So this is about publishing the progress towards the education elevated targets. So those are proficiency on English, language arts, mathematics, science, the things that we measure, graduation rates. So those come in at a certain time each year. So we're compiling all those things based on like, I'm just trying to figure out what would interim progress look like, because the measurement is in the education elevated targets. So again, those are grad rates, proficiency measures.
I can.
Yes,
So
go ahead.
I'm understanding that we're going out on different fact-finding tours and seeing different things that are happening, for example, in Provo School District, and we become aware of those new methods. If we think that they're going to help and they look like real-time, that they're producing good results, that we would publish that and disseminate it without waiting for results to come in. But I understand that this information is being gathered as this group visits different areas and gets different reports.
If I may then, Vice Chair Cummings. So what you're asking to report then are promising practices.
Best practices.
Because we won't have results until we actually get those measures. So progress towards the results would be challenging. But if you want us to report promising practices, that's a different,
So
that's a different measure.
promising practices which will result in, or which should result in, progress toward, is that, I understand the measurements here, and I think, I don't want to usurp the committee's recommendation on that part. I'm just after a real-time report that gets the information out quicker so people can act on it.
Okay, so real-time promising practices is much easier than trying to guess what grad rates and proficiency rates are going to be. Okay.
So without any opposition, I'll substitute promising practices for information in the amendment, in the proposed amendment. Okay, any further discussion to that? Board Member Lear.
I have a clarifying question, and then I have a kind of a thought, and I'm not sure what to do with the thought part. But the clarifying question I had is promising practices toward progress or detailing progress, and then you wouldn't include, would you, toward meeting the board's 2022 education elevated targets? Wouldn't that come out, or would that stay in? I don't get what, I'm trying to decide if Scott wants something more immediate and more simple, and this is more complicated, the way it's written. So somebody help me. What do you mean?
I don't want to change the targets. Carol.
Okay.
I think those targets are what we're aiming for, and so this should just be things that we think are leading us in the right direction to
those
get the
targets.
information out. So still towards those targets.
Okay, that helps me understand that. And
So I'll read what I have here and see if we're all on that same page. So,
Right.
so the amendment, as I'm hearing it, is that we would have staff develop a method of disseminating promising practices toward meeting the board's 2022, et cetera, as stated.
And can I make my second point quickly?
Yes.
I should have read this more carefully and kind of looked at this with the eye that Scott is now, because I was on that task force. But my point is, the most important thing I saw in the many hours that we spent was John Zerbakan's presentation about how he had just through a staff decision, personalized these students' improvement and achievement. And if that could go immediately to any ELL program or people, I think it could really change or make them at least think, how could we do this? Because I think his was a little bit skewed because there are so few ELL students he was dealing with. And it maybe wouldn't work in Salt Lake as beautifully. But just seeing that and getting that out there instead of keeping it in Davis District, I think is what we're aspiring to. And so I hope that's the message that is communicated in these new words.
Yes, Dr. Estrada?
Yeah, I'd just like to clarify a little bit. The reason it's so successful in Davis is that they redesigned comprehensive counseling to personalize it. And they used processes, procedures, tools, and structures to weave that into the culture of the entire organization, as well as making counselors and principals accountable for every single English learner. That's the way they did it. Just to clarify.
Thank you. Board Member Earl?
Yeah, I guess I would just be saying something similar to Scott. I think it's just that I think the best practices is what needs to be out there because that's what's going to help people improve. And so what you're saying here is just getting it out so people can hear it. So,
Okay, Chair Huntsman?
I see a little problem. I'm putting myself on the operational side of this request here about having staff put out there early these best promising practices and I'd look at our staff size, we're limited on our staff a little bit. And then it puts our staff in a position of they appear to be promising and as soon as you get your results in, then they are promising. So the way that I'm reading and understanding this, and maybe I'm wrong on this, is we're wanting staff to, before the results are in, but they have the appearance of what might be a best practice, to go get that, send that out to all of the districts. And I see that as a little bit of a challenge, but when this office is sending out all these best practices, let's just say on ELL, and is that going to be the new practice on all of the other operational things where the districts already have a particular strategy and program in place in dealing with their ELL, and it's almost like steering a houseboat, and that it takes a commitment way early from the local board and the specialists that are in the districts to make those tweaks to mirror some of these best practices. And so I look at the results. I'm just throwing this out a little early as a concern, that if people are seeking that and you're an LEA and seeking it, you can certainly communicate right now at this office, say I'm seeking something, but I'm kind of a little bit concerned that it's going to be a little bit too aggressive and might not best, especially if the results, as we put out there, this appears to be a promising best practice, and then it's not, and then they go make their course correction. I don't think that's really going to happen, but I think timely, is it really going to, are we just going to get the message early? But when will they steer their ship? And I think a lot of people they steer their ship based on those results. So I just throw that concern. I don't know if that's legitimate or not. So I would ask staff, is that a legitimate concern?
Okay, so maybe this will help. Every single year, when anyone applies for Title III funding because they're eligible in relationship to the number of English learners in their charter school or wherever they are, they actually apply for funding. And in those applications, it's incredibly clear about how they use the data and the approaches based on the monitoring visit and the recommendations with consultation, so it's in between that. I just had a consultation with Canyons. I had a consultation with Tooele. So by November 1st, you'll actually have districts making decisions that are actually connected to the applications based on the progress they see, right? So there's another systemic that already exists. We don't have to create anything extra from that. And if you actually want to see some brilliant work in relationship to district self-assessments and the way in which they use data to identify the support that they're providing for TSI schools and EL, then all of that is like you'd actually see it every November. So that's another thing. See, ultimately, the question is, how do you build the capacity of the LEA? Because the patterns that I've seen that are promising practices are patterns across districts. It's not like it's in a different context, right? Same thing with the recommendations. I mean, the recommendations, they're basically 4 patterns, of all the major districts that we visited in the last year. So the advantage is those recommendations and the promising practices inform their annual school improvement plan, the way in which they use extra funding. So, the question is, how much do you want to know? And then, how will that benefit the work that the board does?
So if I understand you correctly, that there are a lot of systems in place, including possible partnerships with ULEAD and other places that this development probably wouldn't have to occur from ground up, but there's some structures already in place that would help promote the ability to get this information disseminated. Is that
Yes.
correct? Okay. Okay, Board Member Davis, Cindy Davis?
I was just going to say that the word promising lends itself to not have to be an after the fact. I mean, we see some of these patterns. We think they're promising based on our expertise. We're quickly sharing them based on Board Member Hanson's request with others who could benefit, and then we're reporting at the end.
Board Member Hanson? Linda Hanson?
So just a question and then maybe a motion. So are these promising practices based on data? Or is it something we're just subjectively looking at and going, oh,
Well, they're
this
actually,
looks pretty good?
well, they're actually based on evidence-based research. So, I don't really have subjective opinions. I mean, I actually focus on, and if you look at the observation tool, it's based on research from Stanford on Hattie's, meta-analysis. And so we use the tool that's based on research and scaffolding grade-level content to give the kind of feedback that would be meaningful in the classroom for the principals and the coaches and the administrative team.
Okay, so it is based on your experience?
No,
And
it's
research.
actually based on research, based on the work that I've done as a researcher.
Right, but, yeah, so your
Yeah.
experience as a researcher, right? I still think that we need to add ULEAD here because I think this is exactly what ULEAD is supposed to be doing. And if the legislature has set ULEAD up to do that, then, and we're not using ULEAD, then I think that we need to work somehow in conjunction with that or add, let's see, add somewhere in there the comments that you made before, Brittany, about ULEAD.
So can I just speak to this? So we have the ability to steer the ULEAD committee through our representative on that committee. And so we could just add in there that part of that methodology would be to request that ULEAD prioritize the dissemination of promising practices in this regard. So I
Okay.
think it was just,
So that would be my motion. And so those of you who don't know, Jeff Moss used to sit on this board, and when he got on the legislature, that was one of the things that he wanted to improve, was so that things would get disseminated and these promising practices would go out to more people. And so that's why he created, through the legislature, ULEAD. And so I think we should at least put them in the loop, so.
so is your amendment then to add after promising practices, including a priority request to ULEAD?
Yes, that would be
Okay.
fine.
Is there a second to that amendment, to the amendment? Is that a second? Okay, so the amendment before us right now is to add the words include, after promising practices, put including a priority request to ULEAD. So this wouldn't supersede or stop any efforts that are happening here, but it would also ask that our representative on ULEAD ask for this to be a priority of that committee. So is there any discussion to that? Superintendent Dixon?
Yeah, I'm going to be transparent with my frustrations a little bit. So the task force looked at the need for a report against our education elevated targets, specific to English language learners. That's the purpose of the report. And as has been described, the report then would generate interest by those who don't fare as well in the report and those who have done well. So it's looking at the outliers and creating a culture whereby people want to know what they can do differently. I fear a bit that we're now starting to get into this discussion about dissemination of work, which we do as a natural part of our job. So you lead as part of it. We have all sorts of ways. We have webinars. We go out and model. I mean, I can name all sorts of ways that we get this out. I see regional service center reps sitting out there. They disseminate this in their regions. There are all sorts of ways we get this information out there. So you could create a whole long list in here about how to disseminate information. And is that really what you want to start doing? And directing staff about how to do all of this stuff? Because we disseminate information all the time in a variety of ways. We can always get better. The key is, how does it get to the classroom? And again, this EL work is the best I've seen at getting it into the classroom. And I feel like we're sort of getting away from that. So know that ULEAD, for example, did some really good work with literacy this summer of looking at the outliers, but it was based on education elevated data. So they brought the outliers together in a summit and had them share what they're doing and learn from each other. And then that creates this core group of best literacy practices that they then share within their own district and work with our staff on as well. So I just want to caution the board that we're going to start adding all of these things into a motion that was really meant to create a report based on education elevated data. So you may want to, if you want a different motion about how to disseminate practices, I just think you're going to get really, you might get bogged down in trying to dictate how we disseminate information. Just trying to avoid a pattern here.
So the current motion or the current amendment is specific to the including priority request to ULEAD. Is there any discussion to that motion in addition to that? So Board Member Hanson. Yep,
Lost the part about real time somewhere.
it's in there.
this.
Sorry, real time, so real time. I'm sorry,
That's not on the board
mine.
right now. So it's in yours, but it's not there. So that's my only comment,
Thank
is
you.
if we can get that back in there, that was an
I didn't know
important
that
part
was
of my
behind it.
motion.
Okay, okay. So that,
Real-time go.
disseminating real-time promising practices. Real-time dissemination.
So where are we putting it?
Before dissemination. Okay, Board Member Cannon.
I would speak against the amendment to the motion. I think that we've had assurances from Dr.
So I'm going to interrupt you really quick. Are you speaking directly to adding ULEAD into the amendment? We're on our second amendment right now. We're amending the amendment. We're
Okay.
just talking specifically about the one in red. Is that what you want to speak to?
No, I want to
Okay.
speak against the whole amendment.
Okay, thank you. Board Member Davis?
I move to divide the question. Can I do that now?
I don't know that we can divide because this isn't a, to add to.
Vote on the report
Because you have an
and
amendment.
then vote on the using,
It's already
Yeah.
divided by the amendment.
So,
and then he'll redo both motions?
so we can't divide. So right
okay, I'll
now, we're
call the
on the
question then
amendment to the
instead.
amendment, which is to add the words, including a priority request to ULEAD. So it's either you do or you do not want to add that to the original amendment. And so are there any questions in regard to that specific amendment to the amendment? Okay, seeing no further discussion, the amendment to the amendment, or the motion before us, is to add the words after promising practices, including a priority request to ULEAD. In parentheses. Okay, all in favor, please say aye. Okay, any opposed, please say no.
No,
Correct. Okay, that motion does not pass. Can the ayes please raise their hand? Okay, Board Member Scott Hanson. Okay. Okay, so that takes us back to the original motion. which I can see now, the original amendment, which is to add the words, to strike the first few words and add the words, develop a method of real-time dissemination of promising practices. Oh, and to strike the words, publish an annual report. Is there any further discussion to that amendment? Yes, Board Member Cannon.
Yes, thank you. I think we've had assurances from staff members here that they all are already doing what Board Member Hanson is interested in seeing in terms of disseminating these things, and that there are things in place to have that going. I think the original motion that calls for an annual report is appropriate because, as Sid said, at certain times in the year, we get all of this kind of information coming in that tells us how things have been happening and how things are going in terms of closing the achievement gap, in terms of closing the opportunity gap that these students experience. And I think we're better off having the annual report, even if it is only 2 annual reports. It certainly will let us know if we're on the way to meeting the needs of these students. So I speak against this motion and in favor of the original motion.
Okay, seeing no other lights or questions, the amendment before us is to strike the words publish an annual report and replace them with develop a method of real-time dissemination of promising practices. All in favor of that amendment, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Okay, will the ayes please raise their hand? Okay, so Board Member Jenny Earl, Board Member Cindy Davis, Board Member Laura Belknap, Board Member Michelle Bolter, Board Member Scott Hansen, Board Member Jennifer Gravitt, Board Member Carol Lear. Okay. That takes us back to the original motion. Oh, sorry, did I miss a vote? Okay, that failed. So now we're back to the original motion, which is on my phone. The original motion is there any further discussion to this motion? Okay, the original motion before us is to publish an annual report detailing, sorry, did I miss something? Okay. Okay, thank you. Publish an annual report detailing progress toward meeting the board's 2022 education elevated targets and closing both the achievement and opportunity gaps between students who are learning English and other student groups. Include in the report status and progress of schools identified for targeted support and improvement status due to the performance of students who are learning English, and highlights of schools and districts that are implementing effective, innovative practices to address the needs of students learning English. All in favor, please say aye. Any opposed? 1. So opposed, Board Member Belknap. That motion passes. Okay, Board Member Cannon.
Here, provide options to the board for encouraging LEAs to distribute funds to schools based on student need, including weighted student funding formulas. I recall as being on part of this task force that Dr. Estrada showed us how so many of these extra needy students weren't getting money, and that there were places where money was available that wasn't being accessed to meet their needs. And I think that is the source of this recommendation.
Okay, so the motion before the board is to, from the committee, is to provide options to the board for encouraging, so move that staff provide options to the board for encouraging LEAs to distribute funds to schools based on student need, including weighted student funding formulas. Is there any discussion to that motion? Okay, Chair Huntsman.
And again, this is to support the It's just for the record here, are those that are listening, the findings number 4.
Yes, thank you. Findings 4. Okay, I don't see any questions or discussion to that motion. Oh, Board Member Linda Hansen.
I'm trying to understand why doesn't staff just encourage LEAs? Is the board going to encourage the LEAs? I
Would you
mean,
like to
just to
speak to
clarifying questions, provide options to the board for encouraging LEAs. It seems like, is the board going to be the one encouraging the LEAs, or is staff going to do it? If staff's going to do it, then let's take out provide options to the board. I don't know, it just seems a little strange.
Okay, Deputy Superintendent Norman, did you want to speak to that?
Right. In speaking to this, Chief of Staff Tiffany Stanley asked if she could come up and answer questions as well. But within this, it was talking about on the committee for it to be a board function, to be able to look through the study analysis and then promote it that way.
So just as a reminder, this finding was linked to some information that we had, as well as future information that the board will have access to. So Tiffany, Chief of Staff Stanley, if you'd like to speak to that.
Thank you. In thinking through options for encouraging LEAs, it may require policy changes or like systems changes in terms of our internal systems and some of our, like the way that we structure our plan requirements and those types of things might be ways to encourage the braiding of funds or weighted student funding formulas. So that's the idea, that since it may require those types of changes, that's where the board would need to be involved.
So I'll give you a concrete example. Can I give you a concrete example? Yes, please. Okay, there's some LEAs that have used Title III funds the same way for the last 30 years. Despite the fact that in one part of the district, there are only 7 English learners, and on the other side of the district, there are like 250. And so instead of thinking about student need in relationship to allocating funds, it ends up being a formula that's not questioned, right? So if the board provides approaches that we've actually seen work, like the one in Provo, where every school uses braided funding in relationship to the needs of English learners who are newcomers, as distinct from those who are level 4 English proficient at a certain grade, then that's the opportunity to help districts understand the way in which they can use funding, braid funds, that are directly connected to outcomes for students, right? Because we have examples of that.
Okay, seeing no further discussion to that motion, the motion before us is to ask staff to provide options to the board for encouraging LEAs to distribute funds to schools based on student need, including weighted student funding formulas. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That motion passes unanimously. Okay, Board Member Cannon?
As we're finishing this up, may I just say hats off and a big thanks to Dr. Estrada, who did such a masterful job of convening and instructing and directing this task force. She's taken on the kids who are the least successful in our system and has really given us ways to help them and to make them more successful. I just think we should give her a little round of applause.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that and your time on that.